Well, we might make a start. My name's Brent. I work with the Baptist Union. Come through, guys. There's 2 seats down here, perfectly for you. And Keith and Alison, you might have to just pull one from up the back there. Great. For those at delegates dinner last night, we managed to have a chat about this issue around our tables. And I know on our table, Paul, we had a very good conversation about this, and the others on our table. So it's a real privilege to get a chance to sit down and talk about such a pressing issue within our churches. So today, that conversation's going to continue, and we've got 3 great panellists who have given up their Saturday to be with us, and they all have very different experiences. And so the format for our workshop is, I think lunch is at 12:15, so we've got a bit of time to work through. So the format is we'll just hear a little bit about the background of our panellists and some of their story. And the most important thing is I think we'll just try and keep it as conversational as possible here, so plenty of time for questions and thoughts from the gathered wisdom in the room as well. So without further ado, I might kick off with John Waltz, if that's all right, mate. Can I start with you, or do you want to start the other end?
Well, I was deliberately looking up there.
Okay. Gwen, are you happy to start then? Or
Look, I'm happy to start. That's
great.
not a problem.
Excellent. And then we can come back to John at the far end.
I'll stand, yeah. So, is it not on? It is on. Oh, okay. Okay. So I'm Gwen Aston, and I tried to get out of this because Brent was saying he wanted someone who was a current practitioner in mental health, and I'm now a retired practitioner, but he said I was still good enough. So
I said you were brilliant, not good enough.
So I have been a GP for 30 years in the Box Hill area, and so yes, I do have some experience in working with patients with mental health. Mental health was one of my particular interests within the breadth of general practice. But in looking at patients with mental health, I also come with a personal interest, because if I look in my extended family, looking at my nieces and nephews and my children and their in-laws, we have 9 people with mental illness. And so there is a sort of personal interest in long-term mental illness as well as a professional interest. And I bring that combined thoughts to the room today. One of the privileges of working in the same area in Box Hill for such a long time is that I see people with mental illness, or saw people with mental illness, through a long period of time. Mental illness is something that travels with people for not a day, not a week like the flu, not a month, but through a long period of time. And so one gets to see the illness with a journey with the person through their illness over time. And in that sense, you see the context as a person goes through different stages of life and how that illness impacts at different stages. And it does indeed have a different impact at different stages. You also see the families of the people with mental illness. And so you know the support or lack of support that this person has within their families. And you also know the impact of the mental illness upon family members, and see it in that family context. And even further than that, you see it within the community context. Over time, you get to know what community resources this person with mental illness is tapping into, and what resources they have not yet discovered or tapped into. And so you can become an advocate for the person who perhaps doesn't have the resources or the knowledge or the tenacity to advocate for themselves. And so one can be an advocate. And you don't need to be a GP to be an advocate for a person with mental illness. So there's great value in tracking with a person with a mental illness over time. But even talking about mental illness is really difficult because it has such a wide spectrum. It's like talking about physical illness. It can be the flu, or it can be cancer, or it can be AIDS. A very, very wide range of experiences. And the same with mental illness. It can be something that is short-term, or it can be something that is long-term and pervasive and affects every aspect of their living. Another great thing for me in working in the one area for such a long time was the ability to develop trust with people with mental illness. And that is something that is often very difficult because people's experience is often one of rejection, one of judgment, one of alienation. But a longer term relationship, which doesn't have to be with a GP, can be with others, develops trust. And with trust comes a greater openness and a greater honesty about what's really going on. And that is a valuable thing in being able to then support that person and to explore then the spiritual impact of this illness upon their relationship with God. They're not going to open up about their spiritual relationship with God in your first week, month, even year perhaps of working with someone. But once trust is developed, you can ask questions of, well, how do you see God in this context, even for a non-Christian? Have you ever thought about God, how God might view you in this situation? And I had some amazing conversations about God with people with mental illness because trust had developed, and I was able to ask very open-ended questions that allowed them to begin to explore their spirituality within the midst of their mental illness. There are four areas of struggle that I was able to crystallise out as I was thinking about what to share. And the first one is the struggle of the person themselves who has the mental illness. They struggle with the symptoms that they have. They struggle with their depression, with their lack of ability to sleep, with their hallucinations. Whatever their symptoms are, they struggle with those symptoms. They may also struggle with the medication that they're on and the side effects of that medication. Some medication can be very helpful for their symptoms, but may well have side effects that are not so helpful, like weight gain, like tiredness, like slurred speech, like muscle spasms. So they're not only struggling now with the symptoms, but also with the medication. And that balance can be quite a difficult one to get the right balance at times. And people themselves with mental illness also struggle with people's reactions to them. That judgmentalism, rejection, or it can be a smothering. It can be a wanting to take over and treat them as children, as babies, as if they haven't got a brain and can't think for themselves. Or even accusations of, if only you did such and such, you wouldn't have this problem. And so people with mental illness can struggle, but also the churches can struggle with people with mental illness, asking the question, where is God in this? We've just heard about the God who is able to do immeasurably more than we think or ask. But he doesn't seem to heal mental illness very often. How do we deal with that? And if this person can get a mental illness, and I can't find a reason, then that makes me vulnerable too. And I might get a mental illness, and I don't like that. Therefore, I need to blame God or blame the other person. So a lot of blaming goes on around mental illness. And some of my patients brought me back incredible stories of what they had been told by church people about why they had mental illnesses and why they weren't getting better. If you want to ask more examples of that, I can give them to you later. And then churches also struggle often with a lack of understanding of what resources are out there. We are not mental hospitals as a church. We are not the mental health system, but often we don't know how to access those things or how to advocate for our church members. So the people with the mental illness struggle, the churches struggle, And I think the mental health system itself struggles to cope with the incredible number of people, 1 in 5 Australians, who have mental illness at some stage. And people with mental illness are individuals. And while the government can make policy decisions that are for the mass group, an individual is an individual, and that policy may not actually be the best for that individual. And so individualising care of a person with a mental illness within a system that operates on policy and group care is a very difficult thing for the mental health system. And the fourth group of people who struggle are the carers. The carers are particularly in long-term mental health, the carers who are responsible day in, day out, week in, week out, caring for these people, knowing when to intervene and when not to intervene, knowing when to go and pick them up in the street and knowing when to leave them for the police, knowing when to get them out of bed and when to let them stay in bed, knowing when to take over their medication use and when not to take over their medication use. Carers also need care. And I think the church can do a lot in caring for the carers of people with mental health. But I think I've probably used up my time, Brent. So I hope that's created a few thoughts, and I'll hand back to you.
That's great, Gwen. Much appreciated. And you can see from the panel we've got today, obviously Gwen's come with the clinical experience, and Lindy brings, I guess, a unique perspective working with Grow, thinking about some effective ways, some really different ways of working with mental illness. And John obviously is a practitioner in the pastoral care area. So we've got a good spread here today. So look, I might just handball to you, John, if that's okay, just to talk through just some of your experience. And we need the mics just because we're recording. Yeah.
Okay. Do I need to stand
that's
up?
on.
Yes. I do.
So over to you.
Okay, I'm John, as you know, and I just realised this thing's being recorded, so not only do I have to watch what I say, because I'll be put right by these two, I will be by you as well. It'll be there for eternity, so yeah, in the ether or in cyberspace or whatever, I don't know. Okay, John, yeah, so how personal will I get knowing that this is being recorded? There's a question. Okay. I think my first experience of mental illness was when my mother had what was known in those days as a nervous breakdown. And that was probably when I was a teenager at the time. And I just remember for years, being afraid that this would happen to me too. So I developed a fear of mental illness, I think, from that time forward. And so it comes up and you bury it, and it comes up and you bury it, and then you meet somebody with a mental illness, or you hear someone's got one, and you get scared, and you don't know how to handle it. That's the background. The trouble is that throughout my life, I have come across these situations, people struggling with mental ill health, and that's been wider family, people who are very close to me, people I love dearly. Whose very lives are at risk because of it. I've been in church situations where families have struggled with a child with mental illness and who has, in spite of all the care that was possible that we knew how to give, suicided. So, it's been I haven't been able to escape it. Obviously I'm a Baptist minister and I've pastored a church, and I must say that I was thoroughly ill-equipped to handle anything to do with mental illness or things like borderline personality disorder, and I was like a lamb to the slaughter. I realise in hindsight. So I couldn't escape it. It was all around me, and then pastoring a church, and then I became the pastoral care coordinator of BapCare for 3.5 years. Not too long ago now. So we're in the 2000s at least, in the years 2000s. We're not too far back. And then towards the end of my time there, Well, the reason my time there pretty much ended was because I saw this job advertisement for a pilot project to set up a mental health chaplaincy in Geelong with a disability organisation, a secular disability organisation, and who, it turns out, had been looking at their policies which said that they needed to take care of people's spiritual and cultural needs. And they realised that they weren't doing any of that, beyond asking, do you have a religion? Tick the box, yes or no. And that was it. That was their spiritual care. So this wouldn't leave me alone. I applied for it, got the job. And so, yeah, it was a 3-year project, starting off at about, very part-time. And, I did it. I set up a mental health chaplaincy in this organisation. The project went for 3 years. After the 3-year project finished, they said, we'd like a chaplain to continue. Would you do it? I said yes, and I'm still there. It's morphed from, it started off as a mental health chaplaincy, but it's really morphed into a general chaplaincy with a particular focus on mental health. They have a section in this organisation, was then called Mental Health Support, which is around the recovery model of helping people who are recovering from mental illness. So I can say that, I've done theological training, yes. I've done some training in counselling at La Trobe as well. But this was my big learning curve. This placement, learning, was a huge learning curve. And I had to confront a lot of my own fears. And I realised that a lot of my fears were groundless. Yeah, so I come to this today. I guess I wouldn't say I'm not going to proclaim to be an expert, but I come from it, I suppose, from the perspective of being someone who attends a church and is involved in a faith community of various descriptions. But I'm also involved with a group of people who, on the whole, have no connection with church. Yet here we are talking about spirituality and spiritual needs. And I'm quite open about my own faith, if I'm asked. It's a secular organisation, so I'm not going to Bible bash or proselytise or anything like that. But if people ask, I'm quite open about my own faith. And I've got the great privilege of exploring spirituality and faith with people who don't, on the whole, connect with church. And I'll just finish and hand over to Lindy in a sec, just to say that probably one of my biggest surprises was, the first question I asked myself was, am I going to be accepted? What are they going to think of this guy who's a chaplain? And what I found was that the vast majority of people had no problem at all talking about faith, spirituality, beliefs. The vast majority, I'd say 99%. Of that 99%, these are not research figures, these are ones I made up, but they kind of reflect anecdotally what I've experienced. Of that 99% of people who had no problem with talking about it with me, 95% of that 99% had some kind of church background, had some kind of Christian, at least Christian influenced worldview, some kind of belief system that was at least partially Christian or whatever, or a concoction of different things. So the vast majority, say 95% of that 99%, and 99% of that 95% had no relationship with the church community at all. And it's got my brain whizzing and thinking ever since. Thank you. You've got your own.
Thanks, John. Over to you, Lindy.
All right, thanks, Brent. So my name's Lindy Croucher, and I've spent all of my adult life in prison ministry, and then about 9 years with Urban Neighbours of Hope, and a couple of years with Urban Seed beyond that. And I think that all of my years in community with people struggling with everyday life issues, there's probably two things that I've become really impressed about the need for and passionate about the need for. One would be the need for people to be empowered to take charge of their own recovery journey. Yeah, so empowered to take charge of their own journey, discover those personal resources that they have within themselves to bring about the changes that they can bring about. And the second is the need for friendship and communities that will dignify that person with mutuality, with mutual friendship, and with community in which they can really fully participate and be made equal. So they're the two things I've become really passionate about. And I'm very grateful to God that along this journey, the way has opened up for me to work for Grow, because Grow is a movement that I think does a brilliant job of really investing in these two approaches to people struggling with a whole range of mental illnesses or just life issues. It's very, very broad. You kind of, pretty well anyone can benefit from participating in a Grow group. So Grow groups meet weekly, and they're peer support groups. And they're peer support groups that use a 12-step program. So 12-step program's a little bit familiar to all of you. I'd like to hear from you, actually. Like, what comes to mind when I say 12 steps? Alcoholics Anonymous. Anything else? Yep, there's all kinds of anonymous 12-step peer support groups around all kinds of different life issues. Is there a word that comes to mind for anyone when I ask you about what do you think is the spirit of a 12-step movement? Like, how would you describe the spirit or the impact or the outcome for people? Yeah, so support's a big focus. And there's a quality of support that you can gain among others who understand and have a similar life struggle. So Grow is a 12-step movement. It began in Sydney, actually, so it's Australian born and grown. Began in Sydney in the 1950s. Really because people who'd had what was called back then a nervous breakdown, may have ended up in hospital, came back out into the community, looked for any kind of community peer support and found it was only AA, really. So they went along to AA and then over time found each other and realised, there's others here who don't have an issue with alcohol but just actually need some down-to-earth, humble peer support. And so then they began to meet separately to AA and reformulated the 12-step program to address a really broad range of just issues of mental and emotional and social wellbeing. And so that's what has developed over time. So Grow is a grassroots community movement run by its members, and the program has come out of the lived experience of its members. We have these processes even now where people are encouraged to write about the things that they discover are working for them in recovery, and then what they write will go through a process across the whole community, the whole movement, of being verified as, yes, that's true, yes, that's what works for us, and yes, we want that to become part of the program. So that's how this has been formed. So real community development approach in that way that empowers the members to both lead their own groups and to form the collective wisdom that we live by. There's lots of very memorable, practical life wisdom in this little book. I've had this one for about 15 years and it's as worn as my Bible. So it really is like my other Bible. And I see Grow as like a school of life. It's the stuff that most of us missed out on in school. It doesn't get taught. Most of us even didn't necessarily consciously get handed down these kind of practical life wisdoms from our parents and our families. So Grow, as I said to begin with, it does emphasise self-activation and empowering the individuals to take charge of their own recovery, and it also creates a kind of community where there's mutuality and participation. We have one of the many mottos in this book is you alone can do it, but you can't do it alone. And for me personally, I'm a field worker, so I just add a bit of support to, I'm in the country in Heathcote, and I support groups in Wangaratta, Benalla, Shepparton, an Indigenous men's rehab near Shep, Kyabram, and we're hoping to restart Bendigo and another one or two within the next year. And usually field workers also have a lived experience of mental illness. For myself, in all of my years as a community worker, I would say I did have some form of breakdown where it was probably more about stress and burnout, and I think many of you who are in ministry would know a little bit about that, might have tasted some of that at different seasons of your journey. So that was the time where I think I really became more aware of some first-hand experience of many of the kinds of symptoms that a lot of folk that I work with do experience. And to just give another good rap for the 12-step movement, I would say that we also say a breakdown can become a breakthrough. And for me, it was that breakdown And that then growing into these steps, that I would say was my most profound receiving of the gospel. So I think there's a really strong overlap between the 12 steps and the gospel. And while in 12-step movements, the majority these days may not be Christian, but if you take that first step, it's to admit that my life's pretty messed up. The second step is to say, and I actually can't fix it, can't do that on my own. And the third step is to say, and so I'm surrendering to the healing power of a wise and loving God, or my higher power, or to the healing power of truth, if you really don't have any faith in a higher power. So even just those first 3 steps, if you really hit rock bottom and come to terms with that, you can receive the gospel at a much deeper level, I would say, than ever before. And then the steps go on to, it's really like a sanctification process of, taking personal inventory and accepting ourselves, taking moral inventory and cleaning out our hearts. And then the further steps are just like this process of being turned inside out, so that it's no longer all about me. I'm not going to be turned in on myself. I'm going to become someone who can look out and serve the community around me and be an agent of change for others. And we would say that recovery depends on that, actually. It depends on discovering how you can help someone outside yourself. So that's a little bit about this movement. No doubt it probably raises more questions than it answers. I would encourage all of you, because I think there's so much potential for a much stronger partnership between churches and 12-step peer support groups. And I would encourage all of you to even drop in and visit a Grow meeting, in which case you'll then have earned the right to buy yourself this little book and carry it around as your second Bible. And I also encourage you, if you do that, if you visit a Grow meeting, to get a sense of what it's all about. Don't judge the whole movement by one meeting. That would be like someone judging the whole Baptist movement by visiting one little Baptist church on one Sunday. So groups do vary in their levels of health, but really those who work the program, I would suggest, and this is a big claim, but in your church communities, if you can identify those who struggle with mental instability and emotional and social instability, I would suggest if they joined Grow and if they really worked this program, they may well become the most mature members of your community. We call this the program of growth to maturity, and I think when you truly work it, even if it doesn't eradicate all the symptoms of mental illness, because that's not what recovery is about. It's not about eradicating all symptoms. It's about discovering how you can develop and sustain, mental well-being and emotional well-being, and learn about sustainable relationships and be a contributing member of the community. And when you get onto that stuff, even if you still battle some of those symptoms for life, you can become one of the most mature contributing members of our society. So that's my encouragement with.
That's fantastic, and I'm sure there's plenty of questions.
I just want to add that saying to Lindy, I plug Grow wherever I can with the people I come across, so I reckon it's fantastic.
I just, I'll ask the first question just for you guys before we get the conversation going. When we're looking into putting together a fact sheet around mental illness and just some of the different clinical diagnosis that goes on and all that sort of stuff, we soon realised, and I talked to a couple of people, that actually we need to frame this much more broadly. This is actually a conversation about mental health, which then can include absolutely everyone, because mental health is important to all of us, and in some ways you can release some of the stigma then if people do struggle with mental illness. So I think, Linda, you were sort of beginning to touch on that at the end then, but I'd just be really keen to get your perspective and just some wisdom on how we might take that approach before we start a broader conversation.
Can I use the program to,
Sure.
to speak to that? So we have a little page in our Blue Book which talks about the dividing line, and it says this: the line between mental health and mental illness, between moral goodness and moral badness, between belief and unbelief. These words are changing. It used to be sexual normality and sexual deviance. It's becoming sexual brokenness and sexual wholeness, I think. Between sound drug use and drug abuse, between love and selfishness, between community and building and community destroying, the line between all of these things does not run down between one discernible group in society and another. It runs right through the heart of every single one of us. And it varies and fluctuates at different times according to, as one or other of two continuously active and opposite processes: personal growth or personal disintegration is currently dominant in our lives. So that was powerful for me. I think when I experienced that breakdown, it was actually a welcome to the human race. You know, I finally had to admit to myself, you're messed up, you haven't got it all together, you can't fix yourself, you know, and welcome to the human race. That is true of every single one of us. And if we don't know it yet, I think we're in denial. And when we discover it, we discover our most powerful source of healing for those around us as well.
I've been you get very conscious of the language people use and the language I use and we use. And coming to things like this, and I've been in a few of them, quite often you'll get people asking questions about how can we help them and how can, you know, we're talking about they and them. And I really want to say that in a space like this, if we can change our thinking to, instead of saying they or them, to we, because we are all in this boat. We are all somewhere on this continuum, you know. So that's all. Thanks. So
Gwen, is there a sort of clinical perspective you can fill us in with?
Yeah, I would just kind of extend that a little bit sideways and say that there are some who have a... we are all on that continuum between the two, and our life experiences, our stressors, our situations we're in will be pushing us across those lines one way or another. But there are those who have a chemical imbalance or a brain physical abnormality that means no matter what, they will sit there with a mental illness all of their lives. And it's not something that they can actually move in terms of that line. So there's mental illness that is innate because of chemical or physical abnormality, and then there's the mental illness that comes out of our experience of being human and living in a fallen world that varies over time.
Was anyone around for the Nourish Day yesterday? A few people. I thought Lindsay Tunbridge's approach was quite interesting, wasn't it, with the neuroscience, and he was talking about homeostasis, and now our physical well-being literally has a homeostasis, just like our blood sugar level and all that sort of stuff. And for me, that was quite enlightening, thinking that, you know, sometimes that can be up and down and all over the place, but for some people, we literally will have to medicate. And when we looked at putting that fact sheet together, there's actually a story of an experience of someone within a church where finally the congregation understood that this is an illness like a diabetes. It's going to have to be medicated for the rest of this person's life. And so I think we're starting to see some breakthroughs in our churches on that. But look, I'm interested in 1 in 5. It's the stats say in our community struggle with mental illness. So that means that people in our churches are definitely there with these issues. So I'd like to just throw it open. I'm going to use a bit of a roving mic just so we can get the conversation recorded. But does anyone have something they want to, a question for the panel, or something they want to make a statement, or yeah? Thanks,
Paul. Oh my God is what I'm thinking. I might look relaxed, but inside my brain is working at 1,000,000 miles an hour, which is pretty normal. Thank you. That was really insightful. If there's 1 in 5 people that have got mental illness, and then there's probably 1 in 2 that is somehow connected to that world, and that's what I find in church life. What you said, John, about that people are scared to somehow experience mental illness. And if it's a history in their family, then that connection, I actually think that's a great insight, because I think people will operate out of those fears. I'm a mental illness sufferer. I suffer from depression. I'm grateful that God has led me on a pathway where medication helps me manage it. But I see a lot of people in our church where that management is not allowing them to function normally, and obviously it's a spectrum. So 2 questions. Theologically, I'm worried about the message our churches tell people, because people just come to me often and they just want me to pray for their healing to fix them. And part of our Christian message about transformation and sanctification is that there's this hope at the end. And they're hoping that the hope is like 2 days from now when the effect of your prayer kicks in. And I don't know, that's just not a reality for most. So I'm worried about that prayer. But I hear from the hope I saw in churches could be very active in providing a resource in hosting grow groups. Is that what I'm hearing? You're just to provide a facility where people can meet together would be an advantage. Because one of the things I saw in our church, when I tried to gather some people who are suffering from mental illness, and I would put them in the group of the ones that their treatments aren't managing it well, they had no capacity to operate peer group together. And that was my thing. Well, how do we help them? I hear what you say, John, but I see myself as one of them.
Thanks, Paul. John, do you want to respond to that first, just with the theological mix there?
My mind's going all over the place too. I think I'm recalling what this may or may not talk about what you've talked about. Just some of the things that come up for me. I think that my observations are that the knowledge of this area within the churches is about the same level of ignorance as it is outside the churches in general. That's my observation. So that says to me, church communities need to educate themselves about this issue. They need to understand, educate about mental illness, about and particularly what the resources are in the community that they can access, and what to do in cases of crisis. So that's a really sort of simple, arm yourself with some education, and churches need education. I think theologically, I've heard of a lot of horror stories of the sort of things that people have said to people, including one person who said to me, someone in this church said to me, blah, blah, blah. So therefore I went and I thought, well, okay, there's no point, I'm going to go and kill myself. And he tried. Okay, so, there are some absolute horror stories out there. And so as part of education, I think that's part of it. We need to talk about it in churches. It's a silent subject often. I think this is a whole other talk. I could get up and people. I asked one person who's a Christian, but a really incredibly strong Christian, and I said, "What would you say to this group of people?" And this person said, first of all, the thing that I sort of confirmed something that I suspected strongly. He said, churches for people with a mental illness are often not a safe place at all. They're not very safe. Now, make of that what you will. We can expand that some other time, but they did not find it was a safe place. That was one. Another was that we tend to, while we need community, while we need other people around us, what we actually, a lot of us do is we go and hide because of shame or guilt or whatever. And so what's needed from my perspective, this person was saying, is constancy, love and friendship. And he said one of the most valuable things that a person said to me was, and I've remembered it all the time, this person said, someone said to this person, you don't have to walk through this alone. So, I don't know, that's...
Gwen, you said you had some stories.
Yeah, but before a story, I'd like to come back to that question about prayer, because I think that is a really crucial one, because it's what people come asking for, is prayer for healing. And the way that I personally have come to deal with that is to take the person and say, well, this is the desire of your heart. Let's tell our Father God that that's what you desire. And that is biblical, to tell the Lord the desires of our hearts. But if we look at Paul's letters in particular, every time he prays for grace and peace. And so with confidence, I can ask God to bless this person right now, today, with an experience of his grace and his peace. And so I take both sides together, telling the Father the desire of the person's heart, but also praying for something that is a practical expression of the Father's love here and now, grace and peace. So
That's really useful, thanks. Lindy, it was mentioned there that could churches facilitate grow groups? I'd imagine if you started one in a church, you might just have a few of the congregation show up and get your critical mass numbers anyway. But is there a way that we can look at churches approaching you to look at that?
Yeah, sure. So over the years, a lot of grow groups have met in churches, as do AA groups and others as well. My current boss is more inclined to be seeking out community centres and places that are neutral on the religious front, because a lot of people will be put off by having to step through the doors of a church. So we do aim for neutrality usually, but of course if you're calling Grow and saying we want to help in whatever way we can, tell us how we can partner with you, you know, we've got a venue, do you want use of it, you know, who knows, they might take that up. And certainly other ways to partner would be to, particularly, like, look at where grow groups currently are in the suburbs of Melbourne, and if you don't have one nearby, if you've got, especially like yourself, with a lived experience of a struggle with depression, or someone else in your congregation who could benefit from Grow, if they're prepared to travel for a little while and attend a grow group elsewhere, then with time, hopefully, they could then come back and help start one in your immediate vicinity, and if they've got that bit of Grow experience, and it's a bit, you know, Grow's a bit precious about their DNA, you know, it's a community movement run by its members, so you need to go and catch it with those who've been around for a while, and then come back and help to establish that culture. That's why someone, I don't know if it was yourself, said if we got everyone together who struggles with mental illness, they couldn't run a meeting, but Grow has the tools for that, you know, and it's been proven by 56 or 7 years now. You know, we have the tools because we've got a little structure that works and that people can learn, and they learn to all exercise leadership in holding the group faithful to that structure for the meeting. And because we've got this program, which is an objective authority that the group, you know, everything in the meeting comes back to the program. You know, this is where we gain our wisdom from. This is what the whole community has agreed is true and works. So we're not just offering our own advice to each other if it's in contradiction to the program. So it works. And while I say there's varying levels of health, that's true. And we say so long as the leadership can outweigh the maladjustment in any given group, where, you know, we can make it, we'll get there. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes groups have to fold because, you know, the maladjustment outweighs the leadership. But mostly the support is there to nurture that leadership and to help address any maladjustment in a group.
Lindy, what about congregations actually beginning their own grow group? So 1 in 5, you got a congregation of 50, you might have 10, you scale that up to 100, all of a sudden you've got, you know, probably a critical mass for a group just even within a congregation. Is that something that Grow could potentially look at supporting?
Potentially. There'd be some dangers about the need for fresh air, I think, in that, because we are an anonymous movement. So when you're all in close together doing life, day in, day out, some of the issues that you need to actually unpack in a Grow meeting, get help for, are actually about your friend over here who's there in the same meeting. That's awkward. That gets difficult. So there's something much, you know, really, like we don't allow for husbands and wives to attend the same Grow group, for siblings to attend the same Grow group. They've got to go to different Grow groups. So yeah, so it is like diversity is helpful, and meeting with people outside your immediate community is refreshing, and it's a safer place. It's a safer place to really unpack your issues and not feel intimidated by, you know, yeah.
I'd say the thought that brought to mind was that if you had a group in your church like that, I think that the plus sides are the plus sides, but the danger of that is that this is the group for them over there, without actually addressing the whole thing about the subject church-wide. The whole understanding of the church theologically, practically, medically, socially in the community, what the resources are. In other words, it's still easy to have it as that little enclave or subgroup over there without it having been normalised so that within the congregation that this is actually a part of human experience that, and it's and addressing it that way. I think
So there could
that's
be some
really important.
pitfalls. Yeah, thanks. I'll pass to Marita first.
Thanks everybody for your wonderful presentations. I'd like to just tease out the theological and spiritual issues a little bit further. It leads me to think about how our worship happens and how we go about worshipping, because sometimes it's very difficult for a person who is experiencing depression, for instance, to participate easily in some of our worship services. And I'm thinking here about the resources that we can access biblically of the Psalms of Lament, and to bring into our worship the stories of people in the Bible who struggled. And I reckon there's probably a lot of biblical characters who had a sense of being alone and depressed, because not everybody is into the rah-rah, everything's wonderful kind of worship. Sometimes we are, but we also have through the church seasons those events in the church year, Holy Week, where walking with Jesus on the way to the cross, and Good Friday, where Jesus says, my God, why have you abandoned me? And that kind of theology, which reminds us that God is a God who suffers with people, and what sits in our biblical canon that we can draw upon, so that people don't feel strange if they can't always express psalms of thanksgiving and celebration. So I think it's a challenge. If people don't feel comfortable in the church, what might be some of the reasons for that? What's the message they're getting about who God is and how you must participate or be in worship? And so I think it's a challenge to our worship leaders and pastors in the way we pray and the songs we choose, or maybe the silence that we may not use, which may be very useful, and healing. It's more a comment than
That's
a
right. I
statement,
think
but
you're all
you're
on the
working in
panel.
that field all the time.
Yeah.
So
Well, I don't mind commenting. It's kind of a subject I think about a lot, just because you talk about. I think one of the things that was interesting, I was saying that Brent, I think when I got the sample questions, one of the questions was, are there any people with a mental illness in your church? And I thought, well, the only reason that there wouldn't be would be if they've self-selected out. Because all the things you're talking about sometimes makes it very difficult. And why, if basically a third of the Psalms of Lament, don't they ever get a hearing? Is it because we don't know what to do with them? Do we always have to be relentlessly positive? Because that's pretty condemning. It's pretty judging, and you feel pretty inferior because you either got to pretend or, whatever. And I think the interesting thing about the Psalms of Lament, for instance, is that they're based in a relationship with God, a trusting relationship with God. So, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, sometimes, that's the question to ask. Those are the questions that are on people's hearts that they don't actually. These are the questions I hear, I guess, a lot. Is why has God done this to me? What did I do wrong? What sin did I commit? All those kinds of things that sees through. And what sort of a God are you talking about here? Those kinds of really very real questions, questions of meaning. How can a good God allow this to happen? All those questions why can't we ask those questions in the faith community? It seems the perfect place for them. If we asked those questions and struggled with them, maybe fewer people would have to, shove down what they're really feeling and thinking, and maybe fewer people would have to feel like that they want to escape and hide.
And if we think about mental health, not just mental illness, then I think there's a lot of questions to ask about our worship services. Because if we look at our modern services, where there is a lot of change, a lot of newness, a lot of creativity, a lot of unpredictability about our services often. They're not, we don't know when we walk in the door what's going to happen like we used to. And therefore that can make it even more unsafe for someone who's already feeling anxious, already feeling difficult about connecting with others. And so we can actually heighten anxiety and heighten that fear of attending because of the way that things are more unpredictable than they used to be. Whereas if we're in a place of good mental health, we like the new and the bouncy and the celebratory, but it actually increases the barrier for those who are not in a place of good mental health, even if we don't have a mental illness.
That's a good point. Question here.
I think on a very practical level, one thing we have to be an awful lot better is just simply accepting people, and sometimes accepting people with different behaviours. I recently, or a few months ago, was at the dedication of a grandchild. Now that was in a church where a big part of the congregation were intellectually disabled. They were quite a noisy group, they sang differently. There was noise during the service, but I thought that was beautiful. It was inclusive. People were accepted. Whereas I go monthly to a service for marginalised persons. Most of them have mental health issues. A lot of the behaviours, talking during communion, would get a tut-tut and a frown. How about the guy, and I could tell you, who was a regular churchgoer, who became unwell and was told, look, go away, come back when you are better. He never went back. You could have just a few quick points. You could have a wonder cure for mental illness tomorrow, whether that be medication, counselling, therapy, and you would still have a lot of very, very disabled people. Because once your mind has been playing tricks on you, once relationships have become polluted, once you have lost your confidence, you might still have a lot of abilities, but you've lost your confidence to operate. Once you start isolating yourself and becoming separate, that is an intensely spiritual experience, as John was talking about. What is this about? What's the purpose? And if you look at the consumer literature, the thing that medication is great and allows a lot of people to function normally, but medication deals with the symptoms. You look at the consumer literature, and the words that comes out again and again is hope. Hope, something to look forward to, and that comes from friends, community, from being together. In the whole mental health area, I think professionals, the value of peer support, the GROW kind of thing, is immensely underestimated.
Thanks, Scotty. Someone want to make a comment on that? It seems like we're in a pretty good place in the
Just a
in
couple
the
of quickies here.
church to be able to address some of that.
Well, just on the peer support thing, I think Lydia would agree. One of the things that does provide hope for me if I'm going through something is to actually meet up with somebody else who is going through that as well and has been able to, recover in their life and recover some of the, regained a different kind of life maybe, but regained life, that it can be done. I'm not stuck in this forever. There is hope. And the other thing, just quickly about the carers just came to mind is that don't ignore the carers. Yes, they go through a lot. I think some of the stuff that I was reading was that the carers, family member carers, are the group of people most at risk of mental illness themselves because of all the stuff in Australia. Think of any other group in Australia.
Yeah, very good point. I'll go up the back here. Thanks.
Yes, hi. I come from a very small church in Kew. We're actually part of a Kew Baptist Church, but we are a small group. My personal experience in my family as well, I have a couple of brothers who I know have mental illness, and also I know a few people in church that have mental illness, and just coincidentally, one of the people supposed to come with us today didn't want to come this morning, and we noticed they have mental illness. The difficult for us is how do we make that first step to... Most people that I know, and even my brother, they don't admit they have a problem. And culturally, it's very hard for us. It's a stigma there that we say that they have mental illness. We can't say it. And that's why a lot of time in church, or even amongst family and friends, we don't say that they have problems. And that is very hard, there's a very fine line to say that, oh, you have a problem. Your book, you said, you got to admit that you messed up, you need help. And that's great. But how do I make that first step to say that they have a problem? Or we can step in and be comfortable to help them. Because unless they admit they have a problem, or some way that we can connect with them and say, we can get help, or together, how do we do that?
I don't think there's any easy answer to that one. Really, like, you know, what I said before about people taking charge of their own recovery journey, well, they're not going to do that until they admit. That's why it's the step one of every 12-step movement. And no one else can bring that home. You know, we can't, and I'm sure all of us have tried on different occasions, haven't we, to help someone see that they have a problem, but until they're ready to see it. And sometimes they've got to hit rock bottom before they will see it. And sometimes I think one thing that we might do unhelpfully is prevent them from hitting rock bottom. Sometimes we actually need to let our loved ones experience the natural consequences of their behaviours and their choices in order for them to hit rock bottom enough to get that insight. So that's about the only little bit of wisdom I have on that, but it's not easy, I know, because it's horrible, especially if you think they might be suicidal, or it's really horrible not to rescue and to protect and to, you know, save people from themselves. But in the end, that they are going to be the only one who can ultimately do that.
I think there is a place for real honesty on the part of those around. So not saying you have a mental illness or that you've got a problem, but this is what I am experiencing in our relationship, and own your experience of their actions or their behaviour or of their words. This is what I hear you saying, and this is how it's impacting me. I wonder if others are feeling that same way when you say these things. So being really brutally honest about your own responses can sometimes help them stop and think about, wow, if that's how he sees me, I wonder if there is something to deal with.
One of the issue I have is even talking to medical professionals. I try to help my brother. Well, clinically, he is diagnosed with mental illness, but family, we cannot speak about it, and we cannot even talk to his doctor about it, because if they said that your brother doesn't authorize you to speak to us, there's nothing we can do. A lot of times very frustrated.
Thanks for sharing that. It's a tough one. Just pass on to David here.
Hi, I come from Ballarat. It's compelling that things sort of fit together when I'm not quite sure why I chose this session, but it fits together with things that have been happening. I was down in Melbourne last weekend at a teachers' conference where, to start off, the speaker asked how many of us had first aid training, and up went all the hands. Then asked how many had actually used CPR, and a few hands went up. And then they asked how many of us had any training in dealing with mental health, and I think there were 2 hands went up. Last night, I was on the phone for half an hour to the mother of a child who's in one of my classes. He was mucked around by a teacher at another school, and it's in a real mess. I got off the phone and burst into tears. And so much of what you've said has been so valuable, but I think, and our church seems to be a magnet. I know that there are problems for many of us within it, and there are many who come to us with problems. The big issue, I think, within our church and possibly within many is this issue of tolerance. People who have who are, further along the spectrum, will stuff things up. They'll say things that we don't necessarily approve of. They'll make responses that are more out there than most of us would do. And we are so ready to judge. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I'll just pass to... Does anyone need to make a comment on that, or I'll pass to Cheryl?
Just two things. One on the prayer issue. I have a real problem with a lot of our culture about prayer, not so much in the way you were talking, but about the issue that Daniel mentioned on gossip, that often, people are given quite confidential prayer points or quite confidential sharing. And a lot of our churches, we have a culture of gossip that we kind of self-righteously say, I'm just sharing this for you for prayer or whatever. So the issue of holding confidentiality of what you're told by people who are vulnerable or fragile, I think is something as a whole Christian movement we really need to get our act together on. But the other question was, you were talking about the need for carers to be cared for and the strains on them. So I'm wondering what you would say to churches as to how we can care for people who we know are facing stresses in their families, and some of that might be quite simple and practical as well.
Yeah, I think it can be very simple and practical. It can be something as simple as a casserole, or it could be something simple as looking after a child so that they can give individual attention to another child. So it could either be looking after the healthy child so they can give some quality time to the one with a mental illness, or it could be spending 2 hours with a child with mental illness so they can give some quality time to the other children. It can be giving, in another situation, it could be giving the carer a weekend off, and one or more people taking over the care of the person with mental illness for a weekend. So there are lots of levels of which the church can actually be supportive without it being too onerous on any one person within the church. But it depends on what the family or the person needs. It could be saying to the person with a mental illness who's never been on holidays, because no one will take them on holidays, come away with me for the day, and come away with me for the weekend, and a group of you taking them on a little holiday. So it depends on what the situation is. But I think it's important to commit to what you can sustain. I think one of the dangers is we commit too easily to long-term ongoing care that we cannot sustain, and then that adds to the disappointment and the rejection. So offering occasional help and actually doing it is far better than offering regular help and letting the person down.
That's good. So consistency is a good thing.
Can I just also, I think part of that, and it's not a thing you do so much, a practical thing. It's to try and make sure that the people who are the carers are actually heard by you, by the church, and recognise that they are doing a difficult thing and that they are doing what they're doing, just so they're not doing it in secret or in the quiet, but being recognised.
Yeah, so there were lots of different kinds of respite that Gwen talked about, but there are also peer support groups for carers too. So Grow in Melbourne has maybe 7 or 8 peer support groups for carers specifically. And I know there are others. There's Carers Victoria and FAMS and other, even Al-Anon, there's other groups that do offer peer support for carers. Unfortunately, I think the rural areas are much less well equipped with those, and those carers would be even more isolated. But in Melbourne, those are available. And there's some Grow literature at the back here, and that includes one card, flyer around our carer groups. Yeah.
I've got to start winding up. I know Tree's got his hand up. I might go to him. But just before we move on, David's point about first aid. Frank Rees mentioned last night that there's actually mental illness or
Mental health first aid.
It is, yeah. So does anyone know much about that? Yeah, John, do you want to?
You guys have done it too? Yeah, mental health first aid, a two-day, one or 2 day course. Anyone can do it, particularly if you've got the pastoral care role in the church. It's essential, I think. And the other one I would add to that, is the assist training, the suicide intervention training. That usually goes a bit longer, usually goes for over 2 days. That's really good stuff too. I mean, as a basic sort of an arsenal or a toolkit for anybody to, because a lot of our stress comes from thinking, what will we do? They're really 2 good things to do, and yeah.
So as far as takeaways today, because we're interested in next steps, obviously we can follow up with Lindy and the GROW program. Sounds like mental health first aid is another thing. And what was the last one, John? Assist? Assist. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
The church that I'm involved in, we all seem to have mental health in some shape or form, including the pastor. So we lament every week and we need joy, but struggling to find joy. But the question I have is, it seems like more private, nearly everyone is on antidepressant of some form. Is it something that we didn't know about in the past, or is it something that's been our lifestyles now that has created more prone to? And if so, what is it about our lifestyle, and how church can create a different culture of living that prevents from that being escalated?
Tree, I think that's an excellent question, and I'll attempt to answer it, then the others can add in. And certainly there's a lot of debate about the answer, and you bring up there the 2 main ideas. Is it that we're recognising it now more, or is it actually increase in incidence? And I think it's fairly clear that the incidence of mental illness has increased over the last generation. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is the globalisation of the world, so that families no longer live close to their extended family, who used to provide that very close-knit community in which we could lament together, in which we could face struggles together. We're now much more isolated as individuals and as nuclear families. And in many cases, the church has not developed the level of tolerance and interaction to replace that family unit of the village of some time ago. I think that if we go back to when we were largely farmers, driving around on our tractors, we had lots of time to think, to meditate, to pray. Now, or when we were sewing our own clothes or growing our own vegetables, we had lots of mental time and space. Now life is so busy, we're all hectic all the time, and we don't process the things that we need to process, so they build up and up and up and up. So our lifestyle is making it much worse.
Any spare moment you see someone?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I've got a spare moment, check
Yes.
Facebook,
Yeah. And so we tend to medicate our own symptoms with alcohol and drugs. And alcohol and drugs themselves are a trigger to mental illness. And of my relatives, in the next generation down, 3/4 of them have started off with drug and alcohols that has led to their schizophrenia or their bipolar or whatever. So it's our lifestyle within a fast-moving, disintegrated world that has, I think, largely contributed to the significant increase in mental illness. So the community life that the church can offer can be a real antidote to that, but it's a challenge.
Do you guys want to make it? Yeah.
Very well responded.
John, is there one last thing that you'd like to just close with as well?
I brought along a few books. I thought I'd read to you from them. No, I won't. Look, a couple that I just wanted to probably So I've got a bunch here, but there's one called, sorry, thanks, Grant, The Pastoral Care of People with Mental Health Problems by Marion L. Carson. It's not too old, I think it's about 2008. I've found it pretty helpful. So anybody in that kind of a role, you can, it's a sort of you can dip into it and dip out of it kind of thing. It's pretty good. And I know this was on Brent's reading list, but Darkness is My Only Companion, written by a minister who suffered bipolar. And it is a in-depth, very personal and searing account of her illness and recovery process, and lots of stuff about theological questions and struggles, and well worth a read, well worth a read. I almost fell in love with her, I love it that much. Darkness is My Only Companion, and it's by Catherine Green McCrate, but it's actually on, I think it's on the bibliography of what Brent's put out.
Right. So yeah, there is a fact sheet. So if you go to the BUV website, if you haven't seen it, yeah. Sorry.
So is anyone a fan of Richard Raw? Does anyone read
Yes,
Richard Raw?
absolutely.
Well, I think he's brilliant, and he's written a book called Breathing Underwater: Spirituality and the 12 Steps. He would say that the 12-step movement is America's single most outstanding contribution to spirituality worldwide. But this is a great book that explores the kind of intersection between the 12 steps and the gospel. So I want to promote that. And my dream down the track is to go part-time with Grow and form a community that nurtures both mental health recovery and discipleship, and so to integrate that. So if anyone wants to talk to me about that, that's like my 5-year, dream down the track.
Excellent. Book to plug, Gwen?
I have no books, but I would just have one parting comment, and that is that not every doctor has an interest in mental health, and you'll all know that. So you often need to look around to find a doctor who will take the time, and you may need to assist someone with a mental illness to look around, find someone who really understands and has a passion for mental illness.
That's really good advice, yeah. So as I said, we had a discussion on this at Delegates Dinner last night, so we'll keep collating stuff that churches are feeding back and keep working towards providing resources for the churches. But thanks so much for participating in the conversation today, and let's put our hands together to thank these guys.